In the time before the time, when the world was young, a great and terrible war raged in the heavens. Up there in Olympus, Zeus and his brothers and sisters waged war against the Titans, the great raging, roaring, thundering beast gods of ancient times that lumbered across the earth. It is said by the poets that the war between gods and Titans lasted but 10 years. But it must be remembered that in this ancient time, 1 year for them would, for a human, a mortal, be perhaps 10,000 years, if not longer. On and on the war raged. Titans causing oceans to explode forth from the bowels of the earth and drown the land, and other oceans to drain away to nothing, causing volcanoes to erupt, exploding their lava upon the earth, causing earthquakes, causing tidal waves, causing chaos and mayhem, and in the heavens itself, the gods raging and roaring caused whirlwinds and tornadoes, caused great explosions of thunder and lightning that ripped the heavens just as the Titans ripped up the earth. On and on it went, year after year after year. And whenever the gods sent messengers down to the earth, they would send beloved Iris, goddess of the rainbow. She would cause a rainbow to appear in the skies, descending down from the earth, and travel upon the rainbow, bearing messages to those beings upon the earth that were loyal to the gods. For not all of the Titans had given themselves over to the armies of Kronos, the roaring, raging, thundering, child-eating leader of those ancient primeval forces. Some of the Titans, like ancient three-faced Hecate, stepped between Olympus and Earth and the underworld. She served the forces of Zeus through choice, rather than the forces of Kronos. And Themis, the ancient sea goddess, also likewise had given herself away from Kronos and in to the Olympian fold. And then there were the beasts and the creatures of the earth, some of them serving Kronos, some of them serving the Olympians, some of them caught betwixt the two, not knowing which way to turn. And as well as the beasts of the earth, there were the trees and the plants and the green growing things of the land, again torn each way and no way. But when messengers came, it was Iris that brought them. Advice and encouragement, guidance and requests for help flew back and forth from earth to heaven and heaven to earth. But Iris, when she had been born of her mother Electra, had not been born alone. She had been born with a twin sister, Arke. But just as Iris had given herself to the service of the Olympians, though she was born of a cloud nymph, a creature of the heavens, not an Olympian herself, but a creature of the heavens, so her sister, when the time came for decision making, and we all face such decisions in our life, such crossroads where we may turn left or right, where we may go one way or the other, just as Iris went one way in service of the Olympians, so our identical twin sister Arke went the other way in service of the forces of Kronos and the Titans. And so sometimes when you see a great rainbow arcing down from the heavens, sometimes you will see a secondary faded pale rainbow, an underlying rainbow arcing from the earth upwards. And that is the bridge by which Arke crosses. Once upon a time it was as vivid and bright as the rainbow of Iris. But at length the war was resolved in the favour of Olympus. Zeus and his brothers and his sisters won this terrible 10-year-long battle. And they consigned the Titans, those of them that had rebelled against the rule of Zeus, consigned them to torment and confinement in the darkest, deepest bowels of the earth, and occasionally one of them will roar and thunder and pull at their chains, or turn over in their tormented sleep. And so the earth above rolls with earthquakes and tidal waves and volcanoes, and terrible events happen, and sometimes many, many die. For still the Titans, even though they are confined, are not without their power to reach out and avenge themselves. And of those who served the forces of Kronos, those who, just as Hecate had turned from Kronos to Olympus, so those like Arke had turned from Olympus to Kronos, so they too were punished, but in different ways. Now when Iris was born, she was born with the most golden, radiant wings, like the wings of a swan, but made from purest gold rather than feather. And so her sister also, Arke, was born feathered, born winged, but her wings were not gold, they were iridescent, the shifting, endless, multiple colours of the rainbow flowing and turning upon her wings. But when Zeus called her to account for her treachery to the people of Olympus, he ripped the wings from her back and cast Arke down to be with her beloved master Kronos in the pits of the earth, although sometimes she still escapes from the pits of the earth long enough to bring messengers from the Titans to those who serve the Titans on the pale secondary rainbow, pale now because she has lost her wings. And of those wings you may well ask what happened to them. Well, he gave them as a wedding gift. He gave them to Thetis and her husband when they were wed. And Thetis kept them as a pretty thing for a while, but when she in her turn gave birth to a child, she gave birth to beautiful Achilles, long and lean and lithe. She gifted him the wings, and he attached them to his ankles, and they shrunk down to a shape and a size that a mere mortal's body, well, a mortal, a hero, a semi-divine being, a demigod, but human-sized demigod nonetheless, shrank down to a size which would match his form and his shape. And so wherever Achilles ran, he ran with the speed with which the rainbow arcs across the sky, the little wings fluttering upon his ankles, invisible to the mortal eye, but granting him such speed, such grace, such agility. And with peace there came all of the adventures and the release and the joy and the cavorting and the frolicking that those who know peace after war embrace, just as those mortals of us had VE Day and VJ Day and other such celebrations at the end of war, so the gods had their own celebrations at the end of war. And Zeus, it has to be said, had a great way of celebrating the end of war through wine and women and pretty boys and song. And one of the women he cast his roving eye upon was Leto, the goddess Leto. Now she was not wholly of the Olympians, for there are other gods and other goddesses in the world aside from those in Olympus. Leto had come from Hyperborea, beyond the northern winds, in the lands that are cold and dark and distant and strange, lands of wolves and bears and wild boars. She had come from there a wandering and exploring across other parts of the world, and eventually in due course she had come within the remit of Greece itself, and there it was that Zeus's eye fell upon her and upon the wolves that accompanied her wherever she went. And Leto was modest and graceful and beautiful and elegant and wise and compassionate, and all of these things excited the eye of Zeus, who wanted to know what lay beneath the veil that draped so modestly across the wandering goddess. And one thing led to another, as it always does with Zeus, and Leto fell pregnant. She grew heavier and heavier and heavier. But Zeus, though he had one piece of a form at the end of the Titanomachy, the great war with the Titans, there are other forms of war to be fought. And certainly within the home, where the husband's eye is constantly straying outside, there are many battles to be fought. And Hera, wife of Zeus, was renowned for her jealousy, for her possessiveness of her husband. And unfortunate it is that she had become possessive of a man who seemed incapable of staying put, whose eye was always wandering to a shapely form. And when she found out that his eye had wandered to Leto, and that Leto now carried his children, well, the fury of Hera knew no bounds. She went about the lands, knowing that Leto had come from Hyperborea. She confined herself not only to Greece, but to every land upon the earth. She went from continent to continent, from country to country, and swore all of terra firma to make a pact with her, that wherever Leto went in her wanderings, for she was, as I said, a great traveller, coming from land to land, wherever she went, no land would permit her to give birth upon it. So she should be forever pregnant, heavier and heavier, and aching and raddled with hemorrhoids and stretch marks, and never able to give birth. This was the vengeance of Hera. And it would have worked. It would, but for one fact. And the fact is this, that Leto, in her wanderings, so heavy with child, and all of the other goddesses of Olympus, Hera excluded, feeling great sympathy for her, directed her from one land to another, and wherever she went, the land turned her away and forbade her from giving birth there. But still those goddesses, feeling sorry for a fellow woman in such a condition, directed her on and on and on until at length, Leto was guided to Delos. Now, Delos was not terra firma. The Isle of Delos was terra infirma, for Delos was a floating island, not rooted in rock to the sea bed. It floated around the oceans. Strange and wonderful a place, with little upon it, very little vegetation, very little wildlife, but a strange and magical place with the most peculiar rock sculptures and carvings shaped by wind and rain and sea foam. A place of beauty and a place of mystery, but of course floating, so never in one place. So when the goddesses of Olympus were trying to direct Leto, they could scarcely tell her to turn left or right, east or north or south or west, for no one knew where Delos would be from one day to the next as it cavorted around upon the ocean currents. But in due course, approaching the agonizing end of her labours, she found the Isle of Delos, and there she settled. And her labour began in earnest. The agonies went on and on and on. And even though Delos had made no pact with Hera, because Hera had not thought to make a pact with it, nonetheless childbirth cannot take place without the necessary attendants. And so the goddesses of Olympus turned and called upon the messenger of the gods. They called upon Iris of the rainbow, and they begged her and pleaded with her that even though she was handmaiden to Hera, would she not go forth upon the earth and seek help from Eilithyia, the goddess of childbirth herself, and bring Eilithyia to floating Delos, there to aid and assist in the actual moment of birth, that Leto should be delivered of children and released from her agonies of a seemingly endless pregnancy. Well, Iris was not without compassion, and though she was a loyal servant to her mistress, she could see the pain that Leto was in. And so she arced across the skies, journeyed to earth, in search of Eilithyia, who had been banished by Hera to far distant parts, to ensure that she could not be at the side of Leto at any juncture. But fast, swift, travelling Iris, who, like her estranged sister in the bowels of Tartarus, in the confines of the prison beneath the earth, like that sister, has fast movement, zoomed hither and yon, east and west, north and south about the earth, zoomed back and forth until finally at length she found Alithia, and then, holding Alithia's hand, granting to her the speed that she possessed by herself, the two of them zoomed back and forth across the world, east and west, north and south, and to that length the eagle eye of Iris spotted the floating island of Delos, which had come within a few miles' distance of mainland Greece. And there she deposited Alithia. And Alithia, surrounded by the wolves of Leto, howling and singing for their mistress, tended to the great swollen belly of Leto, who now looked more like a beached whale than a pregnant woman. So long had she been with child. And with the assistance of Alithia, Leto gave birth not to one child but to two, to twins. And in this, Iris, who was about to depart back to Olympus, was much heartened, for it reminded her of her own twin and the days before the two sisters had become estranged, one from the other, torn apart by politics and conflicting loyalties. And Iris stayed long enough to watch the birth, first of the goddess Artemis, and then of her brother Apollo. And Apollo took Delos to be his own special sacred isle, and erected 4 great pillars upon and through and beneath Delos to anchor it to the seabed. So now Delos stays put, rather than floating about the ocean wave. And there not only is Apollo honoured and Artemis honoured, but their mother Leto too is honoured. And having brought, indirectly, 2 more twins into the world, twins who never have been estranged from one another, unlike poor Arke and her sister Iris, the goddess of the vibrant rainbow, returned to Olympus, and there she resides still, except for those occasions when she brings down messages from above to those humans and beasts and trees and nymphs and dryads and creatures of the world, many and various, messengers sent from Zeus, from Hera, from Apollo, from Artemis, from Hestia, from Poseidon, from all of the gods and the goddesses of far distant Olympus, carrying the words of the gods about the earth, and perhaps one day carrying one to you. Thank you.